Have you ever found yourself in a disagreement with someone utterly convinced of their correctness, despite lacking expertise, proof, or cogent reasoning? They might exude more self-assurance than you've ever felt about anything, leaving you to ponder, quote_0, quote. You've likely encountered discussions about the Dunning-Kruger effect, the concept that those lacking intelligence are unaware of their deficits, and incompetence prevents self-recognition of that very incompetence. However, a lesser-known fact is that Arthur Schopenhauer identified this phenomenon 2 centuries before Dunning and Kruger scientifically validated it. He observed it unfolding everywhere, within academia, social circles, and positions of power. He witnessed individuals of average intellect speaking with absolute conviction, saw the ignorant dismiss brilliance, and perceived how confidently foolish people were in their errors, to the point of being unable to grasp their own incorrectness. He meticulously documented the precise reasons for this occurrence, detailing the psychological mechanism that leads those of limited understanding to believe they are intelligent, not just that they do it, but why they are compelled to. Schopenhauer's discovery was this: the less knowledge people possess, the greater their certainty. While intelligence cultivates doubt, ignorance breeds absolute conviction. This isn't random, it's a predictable pattern intrinsic to how the human mind functions. Today, I'll reveal the specific psychological process that causes unintelligent individuals to perceive themselves as brilliant, not to mock them, but so you can recognize this pattern in others and, more critically, within yourself. The frightening reality is that everyone who has ever been confidently mistaken genuinely believed they were right, including you and me. The Dunning-Kruger effect extends beyond just others. It applies to all of us in areas where our knowledge is deficient, yet we fail to realize it. The critical question is whether you possess the self-awareness to discern when you are acting from ignorance masked as certainty. Grasp this mechanism. You'll never again grasp this mechanism. You'll never again be perplexed by overconfident simpletons. Here is the fundamental mechanism Schopenhauer pinpointed. Intelligence necessitates the capacity to perceive complexity, but this perception in turn requires knowledge. This implies that if you lack sufficient knowledge to recognize complexity, everything appears straightforward, and if everything seems straightforward, you feel assured. He termed this the fool's paradise, a state of blissful confidence stemming from a complete unawareness of the extent of one's own ignorance. Consider the process of acquiring any skill. As a complete novice, you might think, quote, 2. You observe an expert and assume you could easily replicate their actions. Then you try, perform poorly, and realize, quote, 3. Quote, that moment of revelation marks the beginning of true competence, as you can now identify the disparity between your current state and your desired mastery. However, those of limited intellect never experience this epiphany. They never advance far enough to perceive the complexity, thus remaining perpetually in a state of underscore, quote, underscore, quote, underscore, underscore, underscore. Schopenhauer consistently observed this among his contemporaries. Philosophers who had not engaged in deep study would confidently dismiss entire intellectual traditions, not because they had rigorously examined and found them wanting, but because they could not perceive the profound depth they were disregarding. To them, philosophy merely comprised life opinions, simple. They failed to recognize the intricate logical structures, the epistemological frameworks, or the centuries of meticulously refined arguments. Consequently, they felt adequately prepared to hold strong opinions with minimal understanding. The contemporary manifestation of this is ubiquitous. Someone reads a headline about economics and immediately feels certain they comprehend monetary policy. Another watches a history documentary and can now definitively explain the downfall of civilizations. Someone else listens to a psychology podcast and can now diagnose everyone around them. They have absorbed superficial information but are unable to perceive the underlying depths they are missing, leading them to believe their surface-level understanding is complete. Schopenhauer wrote, Why? Because those lacking insight cannot distinguish between superficial and profound content. To them, a complex argument and a simple assertion appear identical, so they will opt for the simpler one because it's easier to grasp. They then erroneously equate ease of understanding with truth. Naval Ravikant perfectly updated this idea. The more you know, the more you realize the vastness of what you don't know. But conversely, the less you know, the less aware you are of your own ignorance, and when you cannot perceive what you are missing, you feel entirely complete. Here's a simple test. Ask someone about a complex subject like economics, politics, philosophy, or science. If they offer a confident, simplistic answer devoid of any caveats, they are operating from a foundation of ignorance. Individuals who genuinely grasp intricacy recognize that no truly valuable concept is simplistic, and those with profound insight invariably express themselves with reservations. Their statements often begin with quote. 6. Absolute certainty is characteristic of ignorance, whereas nuanced expression signifies true comprehension. You've undoubtedly encountered this scenario. Someone gains superficial exposure to a subject, perhaps by reading a few articles, watching some videos, or listening to certain discussions, and then proceeds to discuss it with an unwarranted assurance typically found in seasoned scholars. They fail to differentiate between superficial acquaintance and genuine mastery. Schopenhauer termed this the illusion of comprehension, mistaking mere recognition for actual understanding. You might be familiar with the terminology, grasp the fundamental principles, and even follow conversations about a topic, leading you to believe you understand it. However, proximity to ideas, familiarity, differs fundamentally from the capacity to manipulate them, apply them, test their limits, and understand their constraints, expertise. Familiarity is passive, expertise is active. Naive individuals often cannot discern this difference. Consider the example of Stoicism. Someone encounters it, reads a few quotes from Marcus Aurelius on a social media platform, and subsequently dispenses life advice grounded in Stoic philosophy. Yet, if pressed on Stoicism's perspective on preferred indifference, its resolution to the challenge of external goods, or the distinctions between Stoic and Epicurean ethics, they typically draw a blank. This reveals their lack of genuine understanding. Their familiarity with some quotes mistakenly translates into perceived comprehension, fueling their confidence. Schopenhauer frequently observed this in academia. Colleagues would allude to his work in discussions, employ his specific vocabulary, and reference his concepts, leading him to assume they had engaged with his writings. Then, their subsequent remarks would unequivocally demonstrate a complete misapprehension of his foundational arguments. They possessed a surface-level familiarity with his ideas, capable of correctly citing them, but lacked a deeper grasp. They absorbed merely surface patterns and were unable to perceive the underlying differences. The modern age, particularly with social media, has exacerbated this phenomenon. Everyone seems conversant with everything, yet few genuinely comprehend anything in depth. As you navigate content on neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, political science, or economics, you encounter specific terms, observe debates, and assimilate prevalent talking points. This superficial exposure fosters the misperception of knowledge. _8_. However, knowing about something is not synonymous with truly knowing something. Marcus Aurelius insightfully noted, _9_. Yet, uncritical individuals interpret opinions as facts and perspectives as absolute truths, because they cannot distinguish between mere exposure and genuine understanding. This distinction is crucial. When you confuse familiarity with expertise, your learning ceases. Why would one diligently study what they believe they already comprehend? Consequently, you remain perpetually at a superficial level, falsely convinced of your informed status. This explains why less discerning individuals perceive themselves as intelligent. They conflate recognition with true comprehension. They've heard things, so they believe they know things, and their confidence scales with their exposure, entirely independent of their actual understanding. Before confidently articulating a subject, ask yourself, could I effectively teach this to another person? Could I defend this against rigorous counter-arguments from an expert? Could I apply this concept in an entirely new scenario? If the answer is no, you are merely familiar, not an expert. Familiarity should cultivate curiosity, not conviction. Discerning individuals recognize this crucial separation, while others do not. Schopenhauer also observed a harsh truth. To acknowledge superiority in another, one must possess a certain degree of their own competence. Complete incompetence renders one incapable of even recognizing excellence. A child observing a chess grandmaster, for instance, cannot appreciate the brilliance of their moves. They simply see pieces being shifted. Similarly, someone without musical training cannot differentiate between a virtuoso and a merely proficient player. Both sound good to them. Schopenhauer termed this the competence threshold for recognition. A baseline level of competence is requisite to identify superior competence. This implies that if you are genuinely incompetent, everyone appears roughly equal, the expert and the amateur, the genius and the mediocre. You lack the necessary insight to perceive the disparities. This creates a detrimental cycle. Unable to recognize excellence, you lack a clear goal for improvement. Without a clear aspiration, you never advance, consequently remaining perpetually unable to discern excellence. Schopenhauer witnessed this among philosophy students who would equate Kant's work with a random blogger's philosophical essay, deeming both mere opinions about reality and equally valid. They failed to grasp that Kant meticulously constructed rigorous logical frameworks, while the blogger merely presented unexamined assertions. Observing that distinction demands a philosophical education, which they lacked. Consequently, all philosophical inquiry appeared identical to them. The contemporary manifestation of this phenomenon is ubiquitous. Individuals struggle to differentiate between a scholarly investigation and a blog post superficially referencing scientific principles, or between expert analysis and a confident assertion, or a meticulously reasoned argument and an eloquently delivered speech, simply because they lack the discernment to perceive the underlying disparities. Thus, when they generate substandard contributions of their own, they genuinely believe their work is on par with that of accomplished professionals, as, in their perception, it is. They are not arrogant, they are merely oblivious. Their inadequacy is so profound that they cannot even recognize the chasm. Naval's observation is pertinent here. Specific knowledge is expertise that cannot be acquired through conventional training. If society can instruct you, it can instruct anyone else and easily replace you. Yet individuals lacking insight cannot grasp specific knowledge. It remains imperceptible to them. They only perceive what is obvious to everyone: superficial patterns. They overlook the deep structures that experts discern, and in their oversight, they presume such structures do not exist. For instance, someone might compose an essay that is poorly organized, employs fallacious reasoning, and presents unfounded assertions. Still, to them, it appears indistinguishable from professional essays they have encountered. They fail to recognize the logical inconsistencies in their arguments, the absence of supporting evidence, the abrupt transitions between concepts, or the failure to address counter-arguments. Because discerning these flaws necessitates a skill they don't possess, they submit their work with self-assurance, perhaps even pride, while an expert reviewer identifies glaring deficiencies on every page. The disparity between their self-assessment and reality is immense, yet they remain incapable of perceiving this gap. This constitutes the core issue. Therefore, when individuals lacking insight believe themselves to be intelligent, it is not a delusion, but rather a form of blindness. They are genuinely incapable of recognizing their distance from true competence, as precisely that competence is required to perceive such a distance. Schopenhauer noted that talent strikes a target that no one else can hit, while genius targets what no one else can even see. To this, one might add that those lacking insight cannot even perceive the existence of a target. They equate mere participation with achievement. However, an intriguing facet emerges. Some individuals lacking insight are not simply straightforwardly confident, they are confidently intricate. They employ sophisticated vocabulary, allude to obscure concepts, and construct elaborate theories. Because their discourse sounds complex, they assume they are demonstrating intelligence. Schopenhauer labeled this phenomenon complexity as a substitute for profundity. The conviction that if something is difficult to comprehend, it must inherently be profound. Nevertheless, as Schopenhauer was aware, complexity can obscure incompetence as effectively as it can convey intelligence. Indeed, it often serves as superior camouflage, given that rudimentary incompetence is readily apparent. However, complicated incompetence can deceive others. Consider academic prose, corporate jargon, or superficially intellectual conversations. Someone might assert, the paradigmatic instantiation of post-structural dialectics illuminates the inherent contradictions within hegemonic discourse frameworks. This sounds astute, does it not? Yet, what is its actual meaning? If you strip away the specialized terminology, you are left with a close examination of contemporary concepts reveals inconsistencies in dominant narratives. The intricate version sounds more intelligent, yet it is not. It is merely obfuscated. Schopenhauer was particularly scathing about this habit among philosophers. He would encounter papers replete with specialized terminology, intricate sentence structures, and references to esoteric texts, often to discover an absence of actual insight beneath all that complexity. Just familiar ideas masked in convoluted language. He wrote, "It is just as much a sickness to keep digesting knowledge in the mind without giving it any discharge in work, as it is to eat much and not digest." These individuals consumed complex ideas but failed to assimilate them into genuine understanding. Consequently, they merely reiterated complexity, mistaking it for a display of intelligence. The modern equivalent can be found in TED Talks. Someone delivers a presentation saturated with neuroscientific jargon they barely comprehend, frameworks they did not formulate, studies they cite without having read, and innovative-sounding buzzwords. Because it is complex and delivered with conviction, audiences perceive this individual as brilliant. Yet, if challenged to elucidate the actual mechanism, to defend against expert scrutiny, or to apply it in novel contexts, the facade crumbles. This occurs because they were merely performing intelligence through complexity, rather than demonstrating it through genuine comprehension. Marcus Aurelius cut through such pretense. If you cannot explain something in simple terms, you do not understand it. However, those lacking insight invert this principle. If I cannot explain something in simple terms, it must be truly sophisticated. No, it signifies that you lack sufficient understanding to simplify it. Genuine intelligence can seamlessly switch between complex and simple explanations, adapting to the audience. Performed intelligence, conversely, can only operate in the realm of complexity, as this is where its lack of understanding can be concealed. To detect this, simply ask them to articulate their complex concept in plain language. If they succeed, they truly comprehend it. If they cannot, and instead merely rephrase the complexity in different words, they are merely engaged in a performance. Schopenhauer dedicated years to simplifying complex ideas, rendering challenging philosophical concepts understandable. His contemporaries, however, criticized him, asserting that true philosophy inherently ought to be difficult. Yet, he understood that difficulty in comprehension and profoundness are distinct. Genuinely deep insights sometimes appear straightforward once fully grasped. Often, intricacy is merely muddled thinking disguised as sophistication. Schopenhauer pinpointed a singularly frustrating characteristic: the inability to reform an ignorant individual. This isn't due to their refusal to listen, but rather their lack of a cognitive framework for processing correction. To accept correction, one must acknowledge past error, which necessitates recognizing the discrepancy between one's belief and reality. Without this ability to perceive such a gap, correction is impossible. Instead, it's merely interpreted as disagreement. Schopenhauer termed this the "19" ignorance obstructs the perception of evidence, and this lack of perception in turn reinforces ignorance. It's a self-perpetuating cycle from which escape from within is impossible. Consider debating someone who is confidently mistaken. You present evidence, they dismiss it as just your opinion. You offer data, they question its source, claiming that study is biased. You employ logic, they fail to comprehend, retorting, you're overcomplicating it. Every method you use to correct them proves futile. This isn't because your methods are flawed, but because they lack the capacity to receive correction. It's akin to dispatching a fax to someone without a fax machine. The message is clear, the transmission works, but there's no receiver. Schopenhauer frequently encountered this during academic discussions. He would offer meticulously constructed arguments against adversaries, only for them to retort with misrepresentations of his stance, straw man fallacies, and complete misunderstandings. When he highlighted these issues, they couldn't grasp it, as doing so would require the philosophical training they lacked. Consequently, they simply doubled down on their mistaken views with unwavering conviction. The contemporary manifestation of this is ubiquitous in online arguments. A person makes a statement, you provide counter-evidence, they ignore it and merely reiterate their initial claim. You identify a logical fallacy in their argument. They fail to comprehend what a logical fallacy is and react defensively. It's like speaking entirely different languages, and they are incapable of learning yours because they're unaware of its existence. Naval Ravikant observes, desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want. Applying this, the yearning to always be right is a pact ignorant individuals forge with themselves to never acquire knowledge. Learning demands admitting error, which in turn necessitates realizing one's mistake. If you cannot discern the discrepancy between your convictions and reality, you can never acknowledge being wrong. Thus, you never learn, remaining perpetually self-satisfied in your ignorance. The mechanism is illustrative. Imagine someone convinced the Earth is flat. You display satellite imagery. They claim it's fabricated. You explain physics. They dismiss it as just theory because they don't understand it. You point out ships receding over the horizon. They offer an alternative explanation. Quote 25. Every piece of evidence is reinterpreted through their existing cognitive framework, as accepting the evidence would necessitate abandoning that framework. They cannot abandon it because it is the sole framework they possess. This explains Schopenhauer's assertion, we forfeit 75% of ourselves to conform to others. However, the ignorant have relinquished the capacity for change. They've entrenched themselves in their current understanding, and no amount of evidence can reach someone who has bolted the door from the interior. The implication is clear. You cannot persuade someone out of a belief they did not arrive at through reasoned argument. If their certainty stems from ignorance, evidence will not rectify it, as they lack the conceptual structure to process information that contradicts their ingrained certainties. Schopenhauer recognized that some individuals are beyond reach, not due to obstinacy, but because they are fundamentally incapable of accepting correction. Expending effort trying to correct them only leads to self-frustration. Therefore, Schopenhauer would explain the conviction of the ignorant in their own intelligence not as arrogance, but as a form of structural blindness. They are unaware of their own limitations. They confuse familiarity with actual expertise. They are unable to discern superior skill, and they employ complexity as a deceptive cover. They are impervious to correction, surrounding themselves with opinions that echo their own. Each of these factors reinforces the others, constructing an impregnable stronghold of confident ignorance. And here's the brutal truth. They aren't being deceitful. They genuinely believe in their own intellect, because from within their fortress, they cannot perceive beyond its confines. The walls are too towering, the blindness too absolute. Schopenhauer wrote, quote, 27 ignorant people, however, cannot even perceive that targets exist. These individuals believe life is merely a journey of aimless movement, and they're navigating it flawlessly. This brings up an unsettling inquiry. How can you be certain you don't fall into that category? After all, every misguided soul is convinced of their own brilliance, a group that includes you when you act foolishly. So, what's the way out of this predicament? Schopenhauer's proposed solution is skepticism. Astute individuals are perpetually questioning themselves, not with debilitating uncertainty, but with constructive introspection. This involves asking, quote, 28 those lacking insight never pose these queries, as their conviction shields them from introspection. However, intelligent people dwell in a state of uncertainty, for doubt serves as the sole remedy for complacent ignorance. Naval states, quote, 29, quote, yet, I'd add, the modern fool is someone who opts for dopamine over learning, labeling it as insight. Here's my proposition. Select one belief you hold with strong conviction. Now, dedicate this week to diligently searching for the most compelling arguments opposing your viewpoint. The goal isn't to uncover defects to disregard, but to genuinely assess if your certainty is warranted. If robust counter-arguments elude you, you're not searching diligently enough. And if you discover them but are unable to address them with integrity, you are exhibiting foolishness regarding this subject, which is perfectly normal. Everyone does so about something. The key is whether you possess the modesty to acknowledge it. If this made you uneasy, if you felt resistant while reading this, that's positive. Such discomfort signifies your intellect contending with your ego's yearning for absolute conviction. Pay heed to it. In the comments, type, I'm embracing doubt, not as a flaw, but as enlightenment. Because Schopenhauer understood that the most discerning person recognizes the extent of their own limitations. And the biggest fool is the one utterly oblivious to the profoundness of their own ignorance. Make a judicious choice.